Thanks for joining us for another season of the Brethren Way podcast. Please enjoy this episode of the Calling series, hosted by Brethren Church Director of Pastoral and Congregational Vitality, Miles Larson.
Welcome back, Brethren Way podcast listeners. I'm your host, Miles Larson, in Season 3, where we are discussing calling and what shapes and forms that takes among our pastors and leaders. And today I am with Dr. Yvonne Glass, who is the Executive Dean at Ashland Theological Seminary. And Dr. Glass, I would love if you could start, by way of introduction, just tell us a little bit about how you find yourself where you are, what that call looked like, and how you arrived in this space.
Thank you so much for having me. I started here at the seminary in 2018. I was hired as the director of our clinical mental health counseling program. I have been a counselor for about 20 years now and knew from a young age that I wanted to be a counselor. So I think the first part of my call was becoming a counselor to help people. And then the secondary part of that was my faith journey and talking to my pastor growing up and just feeling also a call for pastoring, but was raised in a church that did not believe in female pastors. And so just navigating through that throughout the years and then finding out that, nope, there are places that really do understand that God does call women into this role. And so have been navigating both of those worlds, able to, at ATS, to integrate both the counseling and the call to pastoring, my Christian worldview, those kinds of things. So that's how I ended up here at ATS and could tell more if we had tons of time. So.
Yes, we would love to hear the whole story for sure. Dr. Glass, are you an ATS alumna?
I am not.
Okay.
I got all three of my degrees from Kent State University.
Oh, great. Fantastic. As I mentioned before we got on the air, so to speak, that I had spent some time as a recruiter at Ashland Theological Seminary and am alumnus. Even in my time, so I graduated in 2013, I've seen some changes in seminary education since 2009 when I started. I'm sure that you've seen some as you've walked through some of these waters. Can you talk a little bit about how maybe over the last 10, 20 years, you've seen some things change? And then I think we'd be remiss if we didn't probably talk about the season after COVID as well and how that has shaped seminary education. Can you just kind of catch us up, reorient us to how things have changed?
I think a big thing that has changed is also what's happening in seminary education is mirrored in the church. Mm-hmm. And so as we've seen church attendance decline over the years and younger generations pulling out of church, we've also seen that there aren't as many people that are interested in seminary education. And so there's been that challenge. Then there's also been the change in higher education. So that impacts theological education, right? We've got both worlds coming in. We've got the higher ed world, and then we also have the spiritual part of our world as well. And so what we've seen is that the way that we do education is different. People can't afford financially or even bandwidth space-wise in life to come to a seminary, study for 3 years, and then go into the field. And then mainstream denominations, as they're struggling, they're no longer requiring seminary education. We've seen an increase in denominations or non-denominational churches that don't require seminary education. And so it really has been on the shoulders of the seminaries to point out what is important about having a seminary education. How is that valuable for church leadership, for pastors, for anybody that feels this calling, this burden in life?
Yeah, it's fascinating. So I was at ATS from 2009 to 2013, and I remember some of the pastors who had gone through seminary and counselors, the generation before me, talked about radical change. They were only gone, generations in the world are 20-ish years. And in seminaries, it seems like they're way more brief than that. And, we hear all these stories. And I know I talk with a lot of our pastors who went to seminary in the 80s and 90s, and they're still just shocked that people don't just go, they don't just up and leave Kentucky or wherever they lived and relocate for 3 years to get the education. And those are some real challenges that I think I'm happy to hear you talk about it, because I sometimes get asked, man, why aren't there more Brethren students at ATS? And that's honestly part of the impetus for this podcast is, man, we have this gap of leaders that I don't think is brethren specific. And it sounds like what you're saying is, yeah, there's just interdenominationally, there's just not as many people going. And that's not an Ashland only thing. Yeah.
No, it's not. And what we see, like, even when I think about like the church that I grew up in, right? My pastor is the same age as my mother, and there's not like a younger generation that's chomping at the bit to take over the leadership role. And my husband is a pastor, and listening to older pastors keep saying to him, "Oh, young man," like, I'm like, we're not that young though. We have grown children. But when you look at the span, there's a 20-year gap, 25, sometimes 30-year gap, that there's no one there to fill it.
Yeah. Well, and it's, I mean, that's disheartening, I guess, because that's everybody, but it makes us not feel alone in that as the brethren, so misery loves company, I guess. Yeah. I just had a conversation this morning with somebody and referred to myself as one of the young brethren, and I'm 45. So I can relate with your situation. Mm-hmm. Dr. Glass, can you talk a little bit about, so pastors are still receiving some training today, is our hope, right? We believe that God calls people, and he also resources and empowers the people that he calls. When you look beyond kind of the formal academy, what training do you see pastors engaging in? How are they getting trained? My hope is that we're not just turning a bunch of people loose to lead flocks. What are some, I guess, some of your competitors, to use kind of a corporate term, but what are some of the ways that pastors are receiving training if they're not going to seminary? So
the scary thing is a lot of the training is happening off the internet, right? Yeah, so people they're watching a lot of YouTube videos. They are reading a lot of articles or books from the internet or from the library. The concern on my end is, if you're not going to seminary, how do you know that this is a valid source? How do you know how to critically review something? Are there questions that you are not wrestling with because you haven't looked at it from this perspective? I was just having a conversation with someone where we were talking about, do we still need the languages? And yeah, we do. I want somebody, like, how can you break down scripture to me if you don't know the original languages? Those kinds of things.
Yeah. Yeah, the vetting process has got to be monitored somehow. And I think that it's so funny that you point out the YouTube training, because I'm a bit of a DIYer, not like professionally or anything, but like I'm a handy guy. And I feel like, man, if you just give me a YouTube video, I can figure out how to do just about anything. And I feel like that has in many ways undermined the role of expertise broadly in culture. And gosh, yeah, I can learn how to install a sink or a faucet, because that's a mechanical thing. But yeah, how do I pastor well? How do I shepherd through this crisis? How do I, and turning to, YouTube or whatever resources your algorithm hands you, does sound like a very dangerous way to do things.
Right. Yeah, there's an excellent book that was written probably about maybe 10, 15 years ago called Death of Expertise, and how important it is that we pay attention to that. With the internet, with technology and knowledge at our fingertips, people know how to read, but they don't know how to critically assess. They don't know how to understand. Whereas generations before, people didn't know how to read. And so that is why we needed seminaries. That's why we needed our pastors used to be the most intellectual people in our congregations. Now we've got education at our fingertips. And so people know how to do certain things, but do they know how to rightly divine scripture? Do they know how to do that? And then the other piece that I'm always concerned about is the spiritual formation. So do our pastors, do our church leaders, do they have opportunities to develop spiritually in a space where there aren't the distractions of life? Do they have the ability to do that? Or is it really, I just have to do this over here, do that over there, and then I spend like 2 minutes? There was an article that was published probably about 20 years ago when we started to see the decline of people going to seminary to learn about different things, about how little pastors read their work. Yeah. Like, I'm like, wait, what? Like my pastor's not reading his scriptures. He's not studying his Bible. And how many of them get up in the pulpit? And I've looked at something 5 minutes before I stood in front of this congregation. And exactly, like that scare. I would never want my surgeon to do that, right?
Right.
And as not just as the dean of the seminary, but just as a believer, I want my pastor to have an understanding of his craft and what it is that he's doing. What is he reading? Is he engaging all these different pieces?
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. I wonder often, how does the seminary respond to this, right? So you have folks who, for good reason, will struggle to just unplug their life and move to a new space for 3 years and put their life on hold. And it comes with a significant price tag. And so we have folks that, not for no reason, are seeking out other ways to train themselves. We've talked about some of the challenges of that. How does the seminary respond to that? Because I think you're right with this, especially the spiritual formation kind of components. One of the things that Ashland has always been known for is that element, right? You don't just come to class, but there's mentoring and there's a community that's developed around this, and you have a cohort of learners. And how does the academy, how does Ashland Theological Seminary kind of respond to those not changing needs, but the changing context and the misunderstood value of those elements that you don't just get by YouTubing?
Right. So I think it's just that, putting out what is the real value of a seminary education. And people will say seminary education is expensive. Well, so is every form of education.
Every education. Yeah.
So is understanding that I'm not paying for the piece of paper. The piece of paper is nice. What I'm paying for is credibility. That I've been trained to do what I say I can do, but it's so much more than that. I'm paying for the ability to know that I'm not fully spiritually formed, because we're still doing that throughout life, but I have the tools that I need in a way that I understand, so that I can communicate that to others to help them, but also so that I can do that for myself. I watched the Twin Flames documentary on Netflix, and it's about this couple that they took bits and pieces of different spiritual disciplines and spiritual belief systems, put them all together, and then created their own thing, and had all these people following it. And it's a cult, essentially. Mm-hmm. Those are the things that we need to teach people that we're doing at the seminary level. Like, when I'm providing with theological education, it is because I have the history, I have the credence to do all of the things that will make it so that people can follow you with confidence. Yeah. I think that's an area that has been filled in by cults or by spiritual guides that don't have that foundation. We talk a lot about spiritual direction and how important that is, but you need people who are rooted in something to guide you in that. And that is what we're providing with theological education.
Yeah, that's so good. I think the anchor point is really important. There's that passage in Hebrews that I think terrifies most pastors, that pastors are going to be held to a higher standard, right? Like, we don't get to just wing it. And right. There's a sense by which, I'm a bookish kind of fellow. I read a lot, and I think I read the right stuff, but so does everybody else, But if there's not some community, and especially as brethren, we are all about community discernment and generational mandates and all these things, it does sort of reiterate the value of learning in a community that has been vetted by experts, that helps to ensure good content and good teaching, and beyond content, those other sort of softer skills of just like doing life and leaving margin and establishing boundaries and soul care and all these sorts of things. So as you look at the next, say, 10, 15 years, what trends do you see? How does the seminary start to, in my role, I'm trying to get ahead of curves, right? And I trust that you are doing the same, of not wanting to just be reactive and responsive, but gosh, what's the writing on the wall, and what are the trends that you see, and how is the seminary going to need to respond accordingly in, say, the next 10 or 15 years?
I think the big way is one of the things that we've been talking about probably for the last 25 years is deconstructing, right? And so I think the way the seminary can get ahead of that is to make sure that people understand that's okay, that it's okay. That's part of our faith development. So part of my dissertation was looking at how do we develop faith over time. And part of understanding what I believe is being able to dismantle what I've been taught and then putting it back together. And so how do we help people do that? Because what we've seen in the last 10 years is people are pulling everything apart,
Yeah.
but not putting it back together.
No plans to. It's just pulling it apart. Yeah.
Just pulling it apart. And I'm like, no. Like, it's okay that you pull it apart, but we need to put it back together too. And so part of getting ahead of that is providing opportunity for people to stand up and say, this is how we put it back together, because I have taught you how to think critically, and then you can realize I'm not putting it together for you, but I'm giving you the tools so that you can put it together for yourself. And so that's how I think that's where we need to move next.
Yeah, and that's so in line with the Brethren. We have this thing called the generational mandate, which is just each generation has to figure out how to take the eternally consistent truths of Scripture and apply them and represent them, package them in a way that resonates with the generation of believers and non-believers. To make it relevant is kind of a overused word, and I think you're exactly right. There's been this long push towards deconstruction, and I'm grateful that you're not ignoring it, that you're not just like, hopefully people won't do that, right? Like, no, people are going to deconstruct. That's just how it's going to flow. So I think that's an important approach, to not have heads in sand about, oh, no. Maybe eventually we'll get past that point. But in this postmodern, post-Christian, pluralistic, syncretistic world, that's going to continue to happen. And so I'm grateful that you're not just avoiding that question. That's good.
The other thing is looking at, one of the things COVID taught us for sure is what Scripture always tells us, right? Forsake not the fellowship of believers. And that COVID made it so people felt like they were afraid of each other. So part of getting ahead of that is, how do we help people connect? How do we help them have conversations? How do we help them build their relationships, hold on to their relationships, those kinds of things. And so going not necessarily back, but back to cohort models, going back to kinds of community and fellowship, because that is what we are as human beings. We are communal. That is what we are to do. And right now, this whole I can be an island on my own, it's not really working real well. And so we need to be leaders in that this is what we're created to do.
Dr. Glass, can you talk, I know as the landscape of education changes, in light of all the things we've talked about, there's still going to be people who can't necessarily go get a master's degree either because of their previous education, their experience. It seems like certificate programs are a big push at the seminary. And I've actually been blessed to be able to be in some of those conversations because I always have ideas. Can you talk a little bit about what the role of certificate programs might be, whether they're professional, I think is the term that you use, professional certificates or graduate certificates, how those might help to close some of these gaps in learning?
In the past, we've done a either or model. Either we have degrees or we have certificates. I think it's a both and. I think that certificates are really important because there's a campaign called Tear the Paper Ceiling. And so you've got people that are pushing in certain fields, you don't need a college degree.
Yeah.
And then there's other people that are like, college degrees are a waste of money. And that is going to put a lot of barriers in place for seminary education because you need a bachelor's degree, right? We have a bachelor's exempt policy, but that still has some requirements of some higher ed. And the whole purpose of the seminary is to equip the local church. And so if the way that we do that is to have certificates for those who don't have the prerequisites, then that's the way that we do that. And then there are going to be those that have a degree that God is calling at a later season. And so we can, like, we're here for you too. So you can do both. And I love the idea of certificates. I also love the idea of having traditional degrees. I think there's room at the table for both.
Yep. That's fantastic. Well, Dr. Glass, do you have any parting thoughts for us? I think this has been very helpful and instructive, and it gives me a little confidence walking into some of the churches, like I've said, are just like, where are all the students? It, I think, helps paint a picture of just the landscape that is, like you said, both higher education and seminary education, which are two kind of streams coalescing in a bit of a quagmire at the moment, just because of the environment. But any parting words for us, encouraging or discouraging?
The parting word is that the scripture reminds us that the harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. And often when I think of that scripture, I'm reminded of my bishop saying, but God never said that there weren't enough. And so as long as we are still doing the work that God has called us to do, there's always going to be enough laborers. And that, to me, is encouraging enough.
That's perfect. Thank you once again, Dr. Glass, for making time. I appreciate the work that you're doing, and just pray special blessings as you lead in this new space. And we're excited to see what you do.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Brethren Way Calling Series. If you liked what you heard, please like and subscribe to the Brethren Way podcast so you can catch every episode. If you have any feedback on the podcast, we'd love to hear from you. Find us on Facebook at The Brethren Church or email us brethren@brethrenchurch.org to share your thoughts and opinions.